This is Lisa Schwartz at Berkeley Lab. Welcome to the webinar for the 10th report in the Future Electric Utility Regulation series. Today, the authors of our new report on the future of transportation electrification will present their perspectives. Utilities, competitive providers, and consumer advocates. Altogether, they'll have about 45 minutes for their presentations, and then we'll take questions from the audience. But before we get to their presentations, I'll take just a few minutes to tell you about the report series and go over webinar logistics. This series of reports is designed to inform ongoing discussions and decisions by utility regulators, policymakers, and the electricity industry. The report series uses a multiple perspectives format to present different points of view on the future of utility regulation and business models and the trade-offs in achieving a reliable, affordable, and flexible power system. The U.S. Department of Energy funds the series. An advisory group helps us prioritize what topics we cover, provides guidance on how we cover them, and reviews the draft reports. Members include representatives of utilities, public utility commissions, consumer advocates, and other experts, and we thank them for their help. We've completed 10 reports so far. Our topic today is the future of transportation electrification and the roles that utilities and charging companies can play. Our next report will address utility investments that improve the resilience of electricity systems, providing state, utility, and consumer perspectives. Before I turn over the mic for today's presentations, here are just a few housekeeping items. First, we're recording the webinar and we'll post it on our website. And second, because of the large number of participants, everyone is in listen mode only except for our presenters, so please use the chat box to send us your questions and comments. You can enter your questions at any time. We'll answer as many as we can following the presentations. You may want to direct your question to a specific author, and if not, I will try to get as many perspectives on the question as I can. The report authors will each have 15 minutes to present, and then I'll moderate Q&A with them. The report and webinar series are posted at the website shown, and following the webinar, we'll post the recording. So today's presenters include Philip Jones. He's the Executive Director of the Alliance for Transportation Electrification, a nonprofit industry association. Philip's consulting firm focuses on regulatory and policy issues related to the electricity grid and cybersecurity. He served for 12 years on the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission, and in 2012 and 2013 as president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. Jonathan Levy is vice president of strategic initiatives at EVgo and an advisor to Vision Ridge Partners, an investment firm focused on sustainable assets. He's been involved with advanced transportation throughout his career. He served as a policy advisor to Congressman Rahm Emanuel and in a variety of positions at the U.S. Department of Energy and the White House. And Jennifer Bosco is a staff attorney at the National Consumer Law Center, where she advocates for low-income consumers in utility proceedings and beyond. Earlier in her career, she was the first director of the Office of Patient Protection at the Massachusetts Health Policy Commission and was an assistant attorney general with the Office of the Massachusetts Attorney General. So each of these authors will cover our 6 questions that you see on this slide and the next slide. And again, following the presentations, we'll respond to questions you post in the chat box. Please post your questions at any time in the chat box. And let's just get started. Philip?
Thank you, Lisa. So good morning to all of you on at least the Pacific Coast where I am. I'm based in Seattle, Washington, but I know many of you are in the Central and Eastern time zones, so good afternoon to you. It's thanks to Lisa and all the staff at LBL for putting this together. The essay I wrote for the report that was published in August was kind of a labor of love. It took when I first talked to Lisa about this, I thought it was going to be a shorter report, but it turned out to be a longer report. I think mine was 40 or 50 pages. But anyway, many of you can download that along with Jonathan's essay and Jennifer's essay. So my role, I am the executive director of a relatively new alliance a coalition. It's an industry-funded group called the Alliance for Transportation Electrification. And what we try to do is advocate for three things in states across the country. We are not focused on the federal government at all. We just believe that since the evolution of the distribution grid and the integration of distributed energy resources, what we call DERs, is going to be a state issue, a commission issue primarily, we really want to focus on the states. So we kicked this off at NARUC in Baltimore in November with about 20 groups, largely utilities, but we also have auto OEMs, EV infrastructure firms, some engineering firms, as well as affiliated groups. And we've grown to about 40 now, and we continue to grow. I think all of you, the response to this call indicates there's growing interest in this topic all across the country. So that's what we do. Several staff, we're really small. And as I say, we like to focus on the not 50 states, but at least 20 states across the country where we think some real action can take place, either by the commission or another state agency or by utilities and stakeholders in that state. So my first slide, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the EV market is growing rapidly. It depends on which projection you read. I like to focus on the Wood McKinsey, which incorporated GTM, as you know, but also the BNEF, the Bloomberg projections. And I just put a little blurb in that Bloomberg, in its latest projection, which they do annually, that came out in May, projects 11 million EVs on the road. These are light-duty vehicles, not the medium and heavy-duty that we'll talk about today, but light-duty only. So 11 million worldwide sales in 25 and 30 million by 2030. Now, how much of that will come to your state or your region in the United States as opposed to China and the European Union? We really don't know yet. The market is developing quickly. Many of you have seen a large number of announcements by auto companies about the number of vehicles they intend to introduce, and each automaker is going to pick their market allocation differently. But I think it's reasonable to assume that China will continue to lead. They're the largest auto market in the world now. They're the largest market for EVs, and they have tremendous incentives and subsidies for both the purchase of the automobile and the building of the infrastructure. So I fully expect China to continue to lead, and of course, many of the U.S. auto OEMs are in that market. And the EU is going to be strong, the European Union. But I think North America and the United States is going to be strong. So I just put a little bullet there saying that if the U.S. can have roughly a 20% market share by 2030, that means that there will be about 6 to 7.5 million sales per year. Now that's sales. So how many autos are going to be on the road, EVs by that date? We don't know exactly yet, but it's a substantial number. Just to put it in perspective, last year the sales of EVs in the United States was 200,000 units, roughly, and we have a little over 1 million EVs on the road today. So these are big numbers. So we believe that there's a big infrastructure gap, meaning the difference between the projected sales of EVs over the next 3, 5, 10 years and the infrastructure that needs to be in place. Every state has inadequate infrastructure right now. Let's be clear about that. Whether it's home charging, workplace charging, intercity corridor charging. So no one is ready for this rapid growth in the market yet, and that's why the Alliance and myself are so active trying to get states, commissions, and stakeholders to engage on this. Even in California, despite the cash from the Volkswagen settlement and what Electrify America is building out for a $2.5 billion national network, which is going to be built out, California gets $800 million of that. Even in California, people estimate that only about a third, 20, 30, 35% of the needs of California are going to be met. And California has some pretty audacious big goals. Southern California Edison's goal, according to its pathway study, is 7 million vehicles on the road by 2030 just in California. Governor Jerry Brown's goal is 5 million. So what are the benefits? I'm not going to get into a lot of the benefits today, but obviously lower transportation costs, given the comparative costs of off-peak charging, which we'll talk about today, through electricity compared to gasoline prices, gasoline and diesel, more competitive industries, lower tailpipe emissions, and this last bullet, really important, more efficient use of the distribution grid. So public sector, who needs to be involved in this? I just list a few here. I talked about the commissions. Regional and local transportation planners, this has been something where state commissions really haven't dealt with before, but they need to be in the conversation at the table. Governor offices are very active here. State energy offices, and I forgot to put up, because of the Volkswagen settlement agreement, the state environmental agencies largely are getting quite involved in the planning and the distribution of those Appendix D dollars. My pitch to the commissions, part of the NARUC family, over 200 commissioners, of course, in 50-plus state commissions around the country, is basically don't wait. Be proactive. Try to get ahead of these issues because they're coming at you pretty quickly. So a few of the tools, a few of the process-related issues that I talk about in my essay is establish a generic proceeding, encourage broad stakeholder process. To date, in my view, there's been far too much litigation, either because a utility files quickly without a good stakeholder process, or there are certain parties in the EV ecosystem that litigate, that try to pursue quite aggressively their own particular business model interests, and that's fine. We live in a capitalist society, of course, and a market economy, but this is a very new and interesting issue that has a lot of public interest components and a lot of public policy components where state and local governments want to move. The third thing is just bring in technical workshops with experts. Policy statement, it's good to issue policy guidance somehow. The Washington UTC, where I served, this was after I left the commission in March of 2017, but in June of 2017 they published a very good policy statement on transportation electrification and what we call EVSE, electric vehicle supply equipment. But some commissions don't like to do that. The chairs prefer to issue their guidance through orders, and that's fine too. Just make sure that you get some guidance out there. Obviously, there will be meetings, different meetings in different areas where the utilities and the stakeholders can meet with the commissioners and the commission staff. But we believe that it's very important that this process be as transparent and open as possible and inclusive of all stakeholders, including non-participants, perhaps in the early years, the low income, the disadvantaged communities, what we call during the Clean Power Plan environmental justice, the EJ community. Best practices, this is just a sampling, but Washington, I think, has a good process. Maryland, through the PC44 process, it started out as a grid modernization proceeding, and it morphed into an EV proceeding. I was just there last Friday. They have a new chairman. They're trying to hopefully wrap things up because they've been at this about 18 months. But it's been a very good process and very inclusive, and it's produced some good utility filings, in my view. The consumer advocate and some of the staff disagree on that, I know. Hawaii has had a very good process. They published an electrification of transportation plan in March. The commission accepted that. That's out for public comment. California, of course, it's interesting. California's been through a transformation, right? In 2012 or so, they prohibited utilities from investing in EV infrastructure. They turned that around several years later. And then SB 350, the statute actually requires the utilities to file and the commission to review, approve, modify, whatever. So California has had a very good process, although very involved, and a lot of stakeholders, as many of you know. Illinois, Next Grid Illinois has been a kind of a grid mod proceeding. EVs are part of that. Ohio, the same. Power Forward was a proceeding initiated by Chairman Hawk and the commissioners, and they just issued their report in August. And then Minnesota just kicked off a generic proceeding in March, and it's out for notice and comment now. Utility role. Why is a utility important? Well, scale is going to be critical in this industry. If you believe the numbers that I showed on the first slide about the hockey stick type growth in the EV industry, the current state of the industry is going to be incapable of meeting those demands in our view. It can be expensive. It can require a longer-term view. So utilities are well suited to respond because of a few reasons. I put a few up here. Infrastructure is a core competency of a utility. They build infrastructure all the time. They maintain the transmission and distribution systems. Generally, they have strong balance sheets. Utilities can take a longer time horizon. As many of you know, depreciation studies that we do in cost of service studies in a rate case for a utility involve assets that are in the ground, plant in service for 20, 30, 40 years. Private or non-utility third-party companies cannot afford to do this. Their payback period, if you will, is much shorter. And, of course, access to capital as well. We believe, and I believe, that the utility can play an important role as a catalyst. The utilities do not want to, and I can assure you of this, they do not want to own and operate everything. They believe that there's going to be a very significant and growing market for this for a number of players, but the utility can play an important role as a catalyst. It can help buy down some of the high CapEx. We may talk about DC fast charging and some of the more expensive infrastructure models, like in dense urban areas as well, urban cluster, DC fast charging, as well as intercity corridor charging. These are quite expensive. Low utilization rates in the early years, but over time, with the higher adoption rate of EVs, they will have higher utilization. And of course, utilities, because they are regulated monopolies, in fact, some would call them instruments of state policy at times, governed by state law and rules, they need to offer these services to all rate classes and all people. So we are arguing that because the future is uncertain, a lot of piloting, a lot of experimentation needs to take place. We are advocating a holistic portfolio approach. This was mentioned prominently in the UTC policy statement, but this has been used for energy efficiency and other emerging technologies in the past, and we think it can work here. Many different types of market models. Utility ownership is one. A simple line extension modification would be another. And then make ready, what is called make ready, which is building the wiring and the conduit out to the stub, and then the consumer or the end user takes over from there and going behind the meter. That would be a third party. That's another model. But there are all sorts of different models out there, and we believe that customer choice is important, but also the utility role is important, because the utility is going to have to, as penetration rates increase, control these assets, or at least know where they are and maintain the reliability of the grid. Flexibility is essential here. I've already talked about pilots. New learnings, conditions evolve. We are not a big fan, frankly, of pilots for pilot's sake. There have been a lot of pilots out there, and I think, depending on which state we talk about today, we've done enough piloting in certain more advanced states like Hawaii, Massachusetts, California I would put in there, even in Washington and Oregon, and perhaps in Illinois and Ohio and some of these other Midwestern states that are getting involved. So we really, when we talk to the utilities who are our members, we really say, do the pilots, learn, but make sure that you can iterate and move forward from there. I think I already covered it on that slide. Utility investment can support and supplement competitive markets. Let me pause there a minute, because I think there are market failures or market gaps today in the market. A couple of them are the multi-unit dwellings, the disadvantaged communities, and some of the more sparsely populated rural areas in the states in our country. So those are areas where the third-party non-utility model doesn't appear to be working well, where we think the utility model can help. The last point that I'm going to dwell on today is interoperability and open standards. We, the Alliance, have been firm on this from the beginning. It's in our guiding principles. Right now, we have proprietary systems being deployed throughout the EV SE ecosystem. Tesla is just one of them, but many of the companies that are being built up are not truly open, both on the back end and the front end. And I think Jonathan's going to talk about some issues on the front end. We, the Alliance, have been particular on what is called OCPP, Open Charge Point Protocol, which is an open networking platform developed actually by the Dutch and the Europeans, but the U.S. industry, the vendors, many utilities are starting to gravitate toward OCPP. So this would allow an open system in which if one part fails, or if the utility or the host site or the workplace, let's say, wants to change from vendor X to vendor Y in the future, they can do it at a low cost. So they don't need to change out every part of the system, the hardware, the communications protocols, the mesh network, and all the IT and the OT that support the system. So we're a big believer in that, and we also believe in open ADR. Many of the EVSE units today, and frankly, some of the automobiles with telematics are coming with capabilities on board, with capabilities of responding to DR, demand response signals. So we believe that open ADR platform is important too. So we're advocating strongly for that, but we do think that OCPI, I think Jonathan's going to talk about that, the front end of the system too, because right now instead of having to carry around like 5 different membership cards or different fob keys, wouldn't it be nice if we could have one card or one key, or at least maybe 1 or 2? It would be much, much more consumer friendly, and it doesn't deal with the plug issue. As many of you know, there are 3 or 4 different types of plugs on the market today. Tesla has one. The SAE standard is 1772. The Japanese have one called CHAdeMO. So I think with adapters and different fixes we can deal with that. But in terms of billing and roaming, just as we faced with the telecommunications industry with wireless, we are going to need a seamless as possible transition for interstate travel and one billing or a simplified billing system. So I think that's my last slide. Conclusion, you can see my conclusion. I'm not going to go through those, but in detail you can read them. But again, commissions need to be proactive. Utilities need to break down silos because they've been siloed in the past between different things. They need to up their game. The stakeholders need to respond. There's a whole new group of stakeholders that need to engage with commissions and state agencies on this. So anyway, we have a lot of work to do, but I'm pleased with the progress we've made just in the last year or two. Okay, on to Jonathan.
Great. Thanks, Philip. I appreciate that. So Jonathan Levy, on an industry perspective.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Phil, and looking forward to also hearing from Jennifer, and I really appreciate everyone dialing in today. I'm going to try and be fairly quick so that we can leave as much time as possible for questions, but I'll try and reinforce some of the points that Phil raised, as well as some other ones that are particular to the private sector charging industry. I think one of the things that's important to note is that you will hear some areas of mainly agreement because there is a broad group of stakeholders that recognize we all need to work together. We all have a shared mission of making sure we enable transportation electrification. There's a lot of different reasons and motivations for it, ranging from the fact that EVs are generally a better way to drive with improved performance, lower total cost of ownership for individual drivers, the benefits to the utility system, as well as the environmental benefits. So for a quick introduction to EVgo, there's a map here, but you can find out a lot more at our website, evgo.com. I'll try not to make this an advertisement, but it's important to note that we are the nation's largest public EV fast charging network, and in fact have a little more than half of the networked public fast chargers across the country. In addition to the 1,000 plus DCFCs, which are 50 kilowatt or greater, we have around the same amount of level 2 chargers. But frankly, we've been emphasizing the fast chargers more and more as additional longer range, lower price EVs that are full BEVs and fast charge capable have come on the market and will continue to. We're seeing very rapid growth, and in fact, we reached in August the same amount of miles powered that EVgo had in all of 2017. So the growth is happening very quickly, and we'll come to a couple of reasons for that, but it all ties back to why we need to work together on this very important market. Sometimes my government history shows, having spent a lot of time in Washington, the other Washington. So I'll start with a BLUF, which is a military acronym for bottom line up front. And first and foremost, it's no longer a question of if EVs will have mass adoption, but how quickly. We're seeing that happening, and more importantly, the automakers have announced $100 billion plus of commitments that show that in addition to demand, there will be a supply-driven market. Policy, which we will all talk about a bit, it continues to be extraordinarily relevant, but the fact that we have the ability to not just have compliance cars but go beyond that is very important. However, we need to have the public charging infrastructure to sell those vehicles and for people to use those vehicles. In fact, a recent conversation with one automaker said they've recently learned that it used to be that the automaker interaction was virtually finished at point of sale with an ICE vehicle, with the exception of service at the dealership. Now they realize that that's only half the battle, and they have to make sure that they're providing a good experience for their customers with electric vehicles after the car has left the lot in terms of charging and general satisfaction. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the top-line benefits to consumers, and really I would like to hit a little bit on rideshare and how it's changing the world as we know it in terms of transportation. EVgo and other charging companies believe that utilities are critical stakeholders here, not just as the electricity suppliers, but as key partners. However, there are occasions where we're concerned about the threat of displacement of private capital, particularly as this market has started to grow. And we really need to think about where we're going, not just today, but for use cases that are arising rapidly. So moving quickly, you may wonder why you're seeing a package of hot dog buns, but if you all remember the movie Father of the Bride, I want to come to reference not only that movie, but our colleagues at Fourth Mobility in the Pacific Northwest. The executive director there, Jeff Allen, often says, let's bury the chicken and the egg and instead talk about the hot dog and the bun. We don't need to think about what's coming first because we know that EV charging and EVs are here. The question is really how many do you need and what has to be built out even more first. So Father of the Bride was the example where Steve Martin has the meltdown in the grocery store because the hot dog buns come in packs that don't add up to the same amount as hot dogs. And it's a similar type of concept for electric vehicle chargers. We have to build the charging infrastructure slightly ahead of the market to enable the sale and use of the vehicles. And then the utilization-driven business model means that when those cars are charging on the existing assets, it creates enough revenue to reinvest and deploy more chargers, which enables more vehicles. We can't build so many that aren't used that the buns get stale, but we have to be able to do this in a way that supports the industry growing and supports the access to those electric vehicles to more people. That's the key point of this slide, but the benefits are covered extensively in the paper, both the points from all three of the authors, and you'll see some literature reference to those general system benefits as well as the individual benefits of electric vehicles, so I won't spend too much time on that. But it is worth just reinforcing what Phil said. That hockey stick is happening, and it's happening very quickly, and we're seeing announcements on the regular now from automakers, including Chinese automakers, ranging from NIO to Faraday to BYD, looking to ramp up in not only their domestic market, but in the European and American markets as well. It is worth noting, though, that we still have an awareness gap, not so much an enthusiasm gap once we get people into cars. Consumer research surveys have shown that even in California, which is by far the most aggressive on electric vehicles and the most advanced in the U.S., more than half of Californians cannot name a single model of electric vehicle, and that includes just being able to say Tesla. And correspondingly, the number one indicator of someone being willing to consider an electric vehicle for purchase is whether or not they know someone who has one, because we have to have awareness. That's why organizations like Veloz are working to raise awareness, and why we all have to work together, whether that's utilities through telling ratepayers, electric vehicle charging companies like EVgo, building out and raising awareness, automakers themselves. All of those are critical partners in going forward, and we need to have the charging infrastructure out there to show and provide confidence. I do want to say that my stock answer on how is the charging infrastructure today is that it's better than you think, but it's harder than you think to install. We have a great deal of chargers. In fact, in California, which is, again, the most robust market, there are more than 500 EVgo DC fast chargers in the state, to the point where 90% of the population lives within 35 miles of that fast charger. Now, we know we're going to need a lot more. Governor Brown has set a goal of 10,000 DC fast chargers in California alone, and we know that there is going to be a great deal of build-out in a number of other markets. The key is going to be figuring out how to do it. A utilization-driven business model works where the vehicles are and where they're being used, but in markets that are less advanced, there needs to be partnerships, and whether those partnerships are with states, automakers, utilities, a combination thereof, those all can work, but we have to make sure we're delivering what the customers need. And that means putting charging where people are going to be, where they live, where they work, where they go to grocery shop. The EVgo mantra is integrating fast charging into your everyday life. So if you're going to the grocery store, and we have over 100 public fast chargers today at Walmart. We have fast chargers at grocery stores like Whole Foods and Lucky's and Save Mart. You just go, you plug in the car, swipe on the EVgo app, and then you go shop, and the car and the charger do the work so that when you come out, you're at 80-85%, and it's part of your everyday life. That's a good way to differentiate rather than just replicating the model of the gas station, but getting better than the model, just like home charging is and so on and so forth. But there will be need for higher throughput DCFCs, particularly on highways. Now, one thing that we have seen is as utilities have gotten more and more interested, as Phil rightly says, they need to be working with experienced partners because it's a lot more difficult than they think, especially in terms of siting. There's the interest of what's important to the utility, where existing capacity in the system is, but we have to focus on the driver. Where is the driver going to charge? Are we integrating into metro areas? Are we putting things where there's something to do if it is a 20-minute charge situation, or are we right-sizing to where the higher throughput charging is in a better area for both the electricity and the driving patterns that are there? Generally speaking, the entire industry is fully supportive of what's called make-ready investments from utilities, which is when the utility does the trenching and lays the conduit and does that pure infrastructure play and leaves the charger and driver interface to the charging companies. Now, at times, there will be situations where it makes sense for the utility to go beyond that, but that is something that is a constant discussion, is case by case, depends on market conditions, and has a great deal of interest from regulators as we all work to bring people up the learning curve on that issue. One thing to watch here is the shift in rideshare usage. This is a slightly dated chart now based on the time horizon of when we were working on this, but the point is that rideshare has become material. EVgo has a great partnership with GM's Maven Gig program, which provides short-term rentals and short-term weekly, biweekly, monthly to rideshare drivers, and that includes the Chevy Bolt, which is a 200-plus mile range electric vehicle that is being put to use for people driving for Uber, Lyft, Postmates, so on and so forth. And those are really high-volume users. The average American can drive around 15,000 miles a year. The average rideshare drivers are driving upwards of 50,000 miles a year, which means a lot more charging, especially for those drivers that live in apartments or don't have access to home charging otherwise. And those drivers are charging multiple times a day in many cases, and they tend to be charging actually times that avoid curtailment of overgeneration of solar in California, and can also be applicable to off-peak charging in other markets to benefit the electricity system. Time of use rates are relevant. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I think it goes again to that point of when is charging happening and how can we work together to develop rational structures. One of the things that is often raised by ratepayer advocates in particular is making sure that we're not penalizing users for non-coincident peak demand. In other words, if if it's 1 o'clock in California and somebody is charging, if 250 kilowatt chargers are charging at once, that's not a bad thing when it's the cheapest energy of the day. And if it would otherwise be curtailed, that's better, as opposed to when everybody comes home and turns their lights and air conditioning on at the same time. Charging happening at that time is more coincident with the peak demand and should have structures that are different. Generally speaking, it ties to a broader point on making sure that we have the proper rate structures, avoid demand charges that disincentivize the installation and usage of public fast charging, and really work together to make sure that we're delivering the best experience for the mom and dad driver, the rideshare driver, the commute driver, everyone in between. Now, in order to promote EV adoption, a lot of it will be the economics of the vehicles, and with battery costs having declined very rapidly and increased performance of the vehicles and awareness, we expect to see mass penetration happening, but we still do need purchase incentives, and EV tax credits have been very important. Georgia is a great case study of that, where there's a robust number of electric vehicles from when the Georgia state tax credit was able to be coupled with the federal EV tax credit. But when that went away, we saw a mass drop-off in sales, showing the importance of that early support. Additionally, the zero-emission vehicle mandate that not only California but a number of other states have joined through Section 177 has provided a market target for automakers, and additionally has provided confidence in availability of models. More models of electric vehicles are available for sale in California, and we expect to see other states see an uptick there, but it will be starting with those ZEV states. We have to have that supply availability that we talked about at the beginning across the country in order to make sure that there is access to everyone here. Additionally, there are all sorts of other ways to make sure that we are promoting electric vehicle charging, that we're working, as Phil had said, as well with the right type of stakeholders. We need to make sure that there are not just the regular utility and charging interests, but also city planners, disadvantaged communities, environmental justice advocates, in part because when it comes to charging, and EVs in particular, there's a notion and a preconception that it's only for rich people. Now, that's partially because of the early stage of the market with higher priced vehicles, but that has changed. However, we have to make sure that there's access to charging, and if you live in an apartment building, and especially if you rely on street parking, level 2 charging at the garage or in the parking lot may not help you, whereas DC fast charging can be. That being said, just like a cup of coffee at Starbucks is more expensive than a cup of coffee at home, DC fast charging in the public sphere is generally, and charging generally in public will be more expensive than charging at home. So how do we work together with policymakers to make sure that that's not a regressive impact on the market? There's also, EVgo's model is as an owner-operator, which is great for retailers and others that would like to have charging on their properties, but because they don't have to put the cash up front. But there are oftentimes misaligned incentives. A grocery store that wants to have charging out in front may not be the owner of the parking lot. It may be a REIT or another entity that has a more spreadsheet-oriented view of what's that parking space worth. So can we have host incentives through property tax abatement or other things? Are there different structures and policy approaches that can work? All of that being said, there are a great number of opportunities to continue to work together to reduce the soft costs, to advance and accelerate permitting, and to really work together across states, utilities, regulatory bodies, automakers, everyone that can work together to make sure that we grow this market quickly and equitably. So a couple of quick points beyond just the three conclusions that are up there at a very high level. One is the fact that Phil mentioned a couple things about the right role of utilities, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more later. But one of the points in my section of the paper is the fact that co-opetition will be likely. In some cases, there's a threat of displacing private investment. In other cases, there's what some have called a crowding in of private investment. We have to make sure that what we're not doing is creating a market where the very, very low cost of capital that the utility has crowds out other capital that is interested in coming in, because we have to be sustainable in both the environmental footprint and the profitability mode for this to work, and that requires high utilization. Additionally, on the interoperability point that Phil mentioned, generally speaking, the industry is moving towards OCPP and OCPI as the open standards. There seems to be a great deal of consensus there. The point that Phil made on OCPP in particular is very important, so that if you do want to have a charger that you buy or that you host, you have the ability to swap out networks, so you're not locked in based on someone's proprietary equipment that can't work with another network. And on the front end side, I think the general view of EVgo and that seems to be developing in the industry is we need to make sure that we have access. The problem of carrying 6 charging network cards, RFID cards, is not the same today as it was before app proliferation. Everybody has an has a Lyft and an Uber app downloaded on their phone, and you don't use the Uber app to call Lyft and vice versa. And generally speaking, we think that's a valuable analog. However, we do want to make sure that there's all sorts of access, either through RFID cards and credit cards and a 24/7 call center to do remote starts, as well as the app approach. All of it is about making sure we do what's best to enable the market while promoting a sustainable business model that can scale. The early days of this industry had some accelerated movement and some deployments early that were focused on just getting things out the door and putting dots on the map. Oftentimes that meant putting a charger in an alley or behind a police station or places that consumers didn't want to be. We need to not just do what's best for the electricity system in building out charging infrastructure and enabling transportation electrification. We need to do what's best for the consumer, which will be slightly different today with early adopters than tomorrow with mass market, and the days to come with connected, autonomous, and shared vehicles that will benefit greatly from being able to maximize the utilization of the car by fast charging, getting back on the road, and then coming back and charging with ubiquity. So with that being said, I'm really looking forward to the questions today, and I'm really excited to have been part of this and really appreciate LBNL for including me.
Thanks, Jonathan. And last but not least, we'll hear from Jennifer Bosco, National Consumer Law Center, with a consumer's perspective. Jennifer?
Hi, thank you, Lisa, and thanks, Phil and Jonathan. I'm Jennifer Bosco. I'm a staff attorney at the National Consumer Law Center, and we're a nonprofit organization that advocates for low-income consumers. And when a group of us here started working on electric vehicle issues, we had a few questions wondering, how is this related to our work for low-income consumers? Aren't electric vehicles just for the wealthy? And we really believe that transportation electrification is proceeding, as Phil and Jonathan described, and that there are potential benefits for low-income consumers. We want to see those benefits shared with low-income consumers in an equitable way, and also identify possible risks for consumers and ways to address and mitigate those risks. So I'm mostly going to be focusing on low-income consumers, but much of what I talk about would be broadly applicable to all consumers. And so National Consumer Law Center sort of advances from these three principles to advance transportation electrification solutions that will increase transportation access and security for economically disadvantaged consumers, equitably allocate costs and benefits, and reduce air pollution and achieve public health benefits, which we believe is also a consumer justice issue. So I'm going to follow along with the kind of the structure of the report and the questions that are posed in the report, starting with the potential benefits and risks of transportation electrification to various sets of consumers. So, and a lot of these have been well documented, so I will just kind of touch on them. So, for one of the things that consumer advocates really consider a primary area of concern are the potential rate impacts, especially the rate impacts on low-income customers. And for context, over 30% of households in the United States report instances of energy insecurity, affordability problems for lower-income customers continue to be major problems, and termination of utility service for non-payment also continues to be a major problem. These issues are more pronounced even for people of color, for African American and Latino communities. And I'll just note that at National Consumer Law Center, we do policy work, but we also do work with individuals and their advocates sometimes. And when we have a steady influx of inquiries from consumers asking for help with utility shutoffs. So this is a problem that continues to face consumers just paying for basic necessities of life, including utility service. But the better news regarding rate impacts is that these rate impacts, potential rate impacts, have been studied pretty closely by M.J. Bradley and others, and the projections generally are that rates are expected to lower in the long run, which is positive news for low-income consumers, for all consumers. Although, we continue to be concerned and watchful for possible short-term increases in rates to fund infrastructure investment. So in addition to those areas, I just want to touch on the issue of will benefits equitably be shared, and just to note that there are certainly examples of other types of new technology that become widespread, but low-income consumers are still left behind. And one example of that is the continuing digital divide, where we kind of take for granted having internet access and cell phone service, but for a lot of low-income people, these still are real challenges, and there is kind of a surprising number of low-income people who lack basic broadband service or internet access. Societal benefits of electric vehicles have also been very well documented. So I will jump to the risks to note that even with incentives, low-income drivers are still much less likely to own a vehicle. And the issue about will additional electricity be produced with renewable energy or fossil fuels, the concern there is that as more electricity is needed, if additional generation is done with fossil fuels, that's going to create more of a pollution burden for the environmental justice communities that Phil had mentioned earlier in his presentation. It's kind of the same issue that Dave Roberts raised recently in his Vox piece about energy storage, when you need to look at what are we storing. And then the other risk that is pointed out here, will less expensive transportation lead to a higher number of vehicle miles traveled? And this is a concern because if there's increased driving by individuals, even in electric vehicles, is this going to create more traffic congestion, and could it be detrimental to public transit? And I would say this risk isn't really an argument against transportation electrification or electric vehicles, but it does support prioritizing shared uses like electrified public transit and school buses. So for the next question, the role of utilities and competitive suppliers. And I guess I'm going to focus more, on the questions around investment here. And advocates for low-income consumers are concerned that investment in infrastructure and other investment costs should not be borne predominantly by low-income people who are the least able to pay and might be the least likely to be early adopters or beneficiaries of the technology. And that's not to minimize or ignore the societal benefits that come with transportation electrification. But as I noted earlier, affordability continues to be a problem. Electricity is already barely affordable for many, and so one of the things we focused on was looking at how to protect poor consumers from rate impacts without impeding transportation electrification. And there are potential rate design models that exist in many states where lower income customers may have discounted rates, or there are bill payment assistance programs, or processes in place that protect vulnerable customers who are facing a shutoff of electric service because of non-payment. And those are all things that can help mitigate that risk. I would say the good news is that so far it looks like rate impacts appear to be very small, but that we need to continue to watch for potential rate increases and address them. So for the question of who will use electric vehicles and how, in the report we really did focus on car ownership issues for lower income consumers. And currently, Americans are holding on to cars much longer than in the past, and average vehicle age for everyone, not just for low-income people who own cars, the average vehicle age is about 11.6 years. So that indicates that some aspects of this this transition might be slow as people are holding on to cars for a considerable length of time. Lower-income consumers are more likely to lack access to any vehicle, and that trend, according to the data we reviewed, is more pronounced for people of color. For low-income drivers who do own a car, as you'd expect, they tend to own older vehicles. And for some low-income consumers, really car ownership might not be their preferred solution. And non-ownership alternatives like public transit, subsidized car share programs, and other programs might be the way to equitably share in the benefits of transportation electrification. So the question of who will pay for infrastructure, and I was glad to hear from Phil that, although I guess I was aware of this, but utilities don't want to own and operate everything. Certainly there is a need for, sometimes utilities are going to be the party best suited to make investments. For instance, the example that's come up a couple times, multifamily housing, or as it's referred to sometimes, multi-unit dwellings. And when this is the case, again, we would just look at the rate impacts on low-income customers to mitigate that. And I just briefly want to talk about time of use rates as a tool for incentivizing right time charging and discharging. And time of use rates may present some challenges for low-income consumers that are different than for other consumers. So low-income consumers may already be so careful about the way that they use energy that it's difficult for them to shift load. They might not have a lot of kind of discretionary appliances such as central air, dishwashers, clothes dryers, pool equipment, that kind of thing that can be turned off or turned down. Lower income and particularly elderly consumers might be using medical equipment that needs to be plugged in. And low-income people are more likely to have to work irregular work schedules where their schedules might not be predictable, or certainly might not be, the Monday through Friday 9 to 5 schedule. So they might need to be using power at times when the rates would be higher. Some options that could help address the needs of those consumers are implementing EV-only time of use rates instead of whole house rates. For certain vulnerable consumers, having a 1-year hold harmless trial period where a customer wouldn't be penalized if their rates actually went up under a time of use rate. Shadow billing to help educate consumers about how their rates would look under different rate structures. And opt-in time of use rates, although I understand there are issues with those. To the extent that advanced metering would be needed for time of use rates, costs of advanced metering should be paid by the participants who actually are driving the EVs and who need that capability, and not spread to all ratepayers. I see time's running a little short, so I just want to mention that the need to work with communities to identify community needs, whether through community needs assessments or other ways. And in their report, we cited to some resources for how to conduct community needs assessments to figure out what are the mobility needs of disadvantaged communities. I also want to mention the potential need for stronger consumer protections to protect customers from the risk of disconnection. So the concern here is that if it's not just household uses that are using electricity, but if a low-income consumer who uses an electric vehicle is now also using electricity to charge their vehicle, they have potentially a higher electric bill. Now, if they are facing a disconnection of their electricity, they're not just risking losing the household uses of electricity, it's also their risk of losing their transportation as well. And so, for these consumers, and we need to look at having stronger protections to make sure that they're protected from shutoffs. And that is pretty much it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. So we got a lot of great questions through the chat box. There's still time to get your questions in, and we'll get started here plowing through them. So the first question that came in through the chat box I wanted to ask is there a best practice example of how a utility can lead in promoting and helping develop a charging infrastructure without negative consequences to charging companies like EVgo's? You mentioned some different models, but also I think there was some reference, Phil, to utilities having some semblance of control over EV SE infrastructure. So, Phil, why don't we start with you on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that one. Well, it's not an easy answer, but let me deal with the California IOUs first. So I think the Southern California Edison programs, both for light duty and heavy duty, have been well received by the third-party community, and this is basically a make-ready and rebate model in Phase 1. Let me be clear. These are Phase 1 pilots. San Diego Gas and Electric has been a little more pushing on the ownership side, especially at the residential level, and they haven't been as successful getting their programs through the commission. But San Diego and Avista up in my state truly believe that a consistent, for a whole bunch of reasons, utility ownership and operation of certain assets makes for a more consistent consumer-friendly experience. But let's talk about Edison first. So you have to break it down into charging types like Jonathan did between residential, level 2 public, workplace charging, urban DC fast charging clusters, and intercity corridor clusters or charging. For the residential space, again, there's some disagreement about what model works best, but I think where ChargePoint and Volta and EVgo and some of the other third-party providers are is that the make-ready and rebate model works best, because that gives a role for the third-party providers and allows the utility to build the make-ready out to the stub, at least for the residential side. There is the full data is not in. There are certain utilities that believe that penetration rates have not gone up as much due to the rebate model because they aren't able to penetrate difficult-to-access locations like MDUs, multi-unit dwellings that Jen talked about. But anyway, that's one where they can work together. Another area where they can work together is for a host site that's a local government or a nonprofit where the utility already has a pre-existing relationship through some program, and then they want to put in some EVSEs, and the utility does the make-ready, and EVgo or somebody comes in to have the station. Now, it's important to note here that generally the model of the non-utility company is to have the host site own and operate the charging station. It's not at least for ChargePoint and others, it's not the utility or anybody else or the vendor that operates it. So if there's a repair, an O&M, or something goes wrong with the charging station, that's generally the parking lot or the mall operator or the hospital or whatever that has to fix that. So that's an issue that needs to be addressed going forward, I think. For workplace charging, I think the model is generally developing that is for the company to deploy. Some companies don't want to own and operate that, and they could give that to an EVgo, a ChargePoint, a Greenlots, or somebody, or they could give it to the utility. But that's a fairly straightforward application. The level 2 public is a bit of an issue because that's where the model, I think it could either be utility owned or it could be a partnership with a third-party provider. It depends on which utility you're talking about and which service territory. And then on intercity corridor charging, there are some publicly funded initiatives going on. As some of you may know, the West Coast Electric Highway in the West, the Rocky Mountain states through the governors are developing a Rocky Mountain kind of an intercity highway. Those are generally a mix where the state agency puts out an RFP, EVgo or a third party responds to the tender, and then they own and operate, or they would operate the stations. I think the ownership maintains with the state agency, but Jonathan could correct me on that. So I guess my answer is it's a little bit mixed, but there are some models, there are some market models existing where utilities and third parties can work together quite well.
All right, thanks, Philip. Jonathan, I know you want to get in here.
Yeah, well, just two kind of quick unrelated points, but the bookend Phil's answer that I think are worth expounding on. One is Phil mentioned that the utilities, the IOUs in California, have had different success going through the regulator, and I think that's a really important point. California Public Utilities Commission has generally said that they do not want the utilities owning public DCFCs except where the private sector isn't, which I think is a really important point because it underscores that where there is a profitable business model, the Utilities Commission does not see a need for ratepayer funds to be there except for that make-ready investment. And oftentimes the rebate approach is challenging because the owner of or the host of the charging station doesn't want to put the capital up. So that ties to the second point, which is Phil's point on uptime maintenance, who's responsible. Not to do too much of an infomercial, but that's part of why EVgo believes so strongly in the owner-operator model, because we're aligned on maximum uptime. We have upwards of 98% uptime because if the charger's down, we're not making money, whereas oftentimes some approaches are to have someone sell a charging station to a host, and then it's up to the host to know, oh, is it down, is it up, what's the price, as opposed to having a consistent network experience. That is an analog that's worth considering and thinking through in terms of other utilities. Will other states that rely on utility investment and ownership need to worry about who's owning at what point, who's responsible for maintenance, will the regulator allow it? It does have a concern raised about patchwork that is just as similar as the other concerns raised about patchwork in the private sector, so it's not like it's completely a non-starter, but it's worth thinking about and engaging as we work to build out this infrastructure.
Thanks, Jonathan. Let's move to another question.
Lisa, if I could, I just wanted to make one last point because Jen mentioned the multi-dwelling units, and I just wanted to say that the lessons learned from Southern California Edison in Phase 1 on the multi-unit dwellings, and remember in the Los Angeles area, I think the figure is 40% plus of people live in apartment buildings or condominiums, so they don't have access to a garage. So Edison found in the Phase 1 that it was very difficult for the landlord or through the homeowners association or whatever to get these things cited in the multi-unit dwellings. So in their Phase 2 filing that's before the Commission right now, they are proposing to overcome this, what they call a market barrier, that up to 35% of the MDUs, these multi-unit dwellings, could be owned and operated, including beyond the meter, by the utility. So this is an example of a pilot that went in the Los Angeles area. The rebate approach, make ready and rebate, did not work to the extent that they wanted it to, so the utility, Edison in this case, is offering to go further.
Thanks. Let's move to another question. Let's try to answer this one pretty quickly because we have a lot of really good questions. So this one involves a definition of public utility under the law and suggests that one of the barriers in deploying fee-based charging systems, has to do with this definition of public utility for charging facilities. Do any state laws exempt, for state agencies that would like to install fee-based charging to provide access? Are you aware of any states that exempt all state agencies from classification as public utilities if they do fee-based charging?
I think there might be two questions embedded in that, Lisa, which is one, is charging considered providing a service or reselling of electricity, which it does vary sometimes by region and is why EVgo and other providers in a lot of markets, and we currently in all, charge by the minute for the service we're providing as opposed to being a reseller of KWH, which would then qualify you as a utility. That, I think, is an important consideration, and we've seen some really productive conversations with utilities that recognize that as a potential barrier and are working with their regulators and others to remove that barrier. The second point is one that is not necessarily just state, but can often be even municipal, of on government property, can there be fees? What are the processes? Does it need council or legislative approval? It's one of those examples that has an analog to solar in that the permitting, the soft costs generally, are just as important as the technology costs, and we have to work together to expedite and bring those costs down.
All right. Phil, do you have any comments on that question?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm going to have to research that more because generally the issue, the legal issue that we face, Lisa, many state commissions have dealt with the legal classification of what is a non-utility service provider versus a fully regulated public service company. So my state, Alabama, Missouri, there have been many commissions who have dealt with that legal issue, and most, as Jonathan said, some of it deals with the sale for resale issue, which is a long, complicated history, both at FERC and state commissions. But anyway, a lot of states have generally said that non-utility third-party providers are not subject to the full body of state utility regulation, although my state exempted the non-utility providers as a regulated monopoly in a statute in 2012, but then the Commission issued a policy statement saying that something like consumer protection issues is kind of a gray area where things go wrong on the warranty with the non-utility provider. If you're a regulated utility, the consumer protection folks can take care of the consumer, but for the non-regulated utility provider, they may not. So, but it's a difficult issue, and many states have not clarified that. But for other state agencies that want to deploy charging stations at their state agency, I would have to do some more research on that.
All right, thanks. Let's turn to another question. Jen, a couple of people have posed some questions related to participation by low-income households in electrification of transportation. And, a pretty blunt question is, how will low-income households who cannot afford the current price of EVs participate? And I know you handle this a bit in the paper with respect to public transportation and, car sharing and hailing services.
Right. I mean, I think that's the question. Oh, and can I just, for the last question that you asked, I think a good resource for that is Dave Collada's report on, might be called 50 States of EV, that looks at different state law issues. But okay, so going back to this, that's why I think in the report we did look at, we did talk about other models besides individual electric vehicle ownership, because I think it is really out of reach for a lot of very low-income consumers, maybe less so for moderate-income consumers. Also I think it's going to vary by area, that it may be that low-income consumers in rural areas who really need to rely on a vehicle, are eventually going to be, might be more interested in electric vehicles as the price continues to go down, especially for used vehicles. And I guess I would note, most people on the call probably know this, but the price for used EVs has gone down so much, and you can get, I think a used Nissan Leaf for less than $10,000 now. So, hopefully that trend is something that eventually can help low-income consumers. But, otherwise I think, focusing on electrifying public transportation, really supporting public transportation, and electrifying school buses and providing other options. I know Sacramento has some, EV car share programs that are targeted at low-income consumers, that kind of looking at models like that. And also, as I mentioned towards the end, really trying to reach out to the community and do a needs assessment of what are the mobility needs of that community. Really take your guidance from that community. And I mentioned that there are in the report we had noted some resources, but I just want to say the Green Lining Institute in California has done quite a bit about that, and they have an electric vehicle equity toolkit that talks about this issue as well.
And Jennifer hit that out of the park. I would just add,
So hang on one second. Let me ask a follow-up question, and then you can maybe respond to this is related. Will there need to be a priority set for public charging places, various kinds of transit before private vehicles? I think that's a good related question to respond to.
For Jennifer or for me, just to clarify?
Well, if it's for me, a priority for public charging as opposed to individual charging?
Right. I mean, like transit, for example.
Yeah. I mean, possibly for transit and school buses, but I think also, that there has been a focus on multifamily housing as well. That's something that may enable low-income consumers to use EVs more. I don't know. I'm not sure how I would prioritize one over the other. I don't know if we necessarily have to, although I'd be interested to hear what others think.
Yeah, I mean, I think on that particular point. Yeah, sure. So I think on that particular point, 3 quick observations. One is our experience has been that particularly in the lowest income segments, trying to rely on charging in the property itself for multi-unit dwellings has been ineffective, because of the high number of people that have to rely on street parking, and therefore having even a bank of chargers in an apartment building is not necessarily helpful to them, especially when they're level 2 chargers. So we've seen DCFC be really critically important to make sure that people have access there. The second point is I fully agree that having near transit, especially hubs that have both the level 2 longer dwell time for commuters, as well as then public fast charging for rideshare drivers and others that are coming in and out and quickly, the kiss and ride types, those are really key to enable the last mile transit, but also to be able to clean up the whole chain soup to nuts. And the third point is really what we've seen is generally rideshare drivers, not all, but a high percentage tend to be subprime credits. And so even with lower cost vehicles, they have a hard time getting the financing. And so short-term rental programs, whether it's the Maven Gig program or, for example, Wave Car in Santa Monica provides 2 hours free of an EV rental so that you can participate in the gig economy. Those are economic enablers, and they allow you to benefit from the lower total cost of ownership of the EV in addition to the rest of the benefits that you get in participating in that. And so I think some of it is making sure we're building everywhere and we're building in those different use cases, and some is making sure we're getting access to the vehicles, not necessarily on a personally owned vehicle basis.
Phil, do you have any comments on the priority here?
Yeah, I think, following off on Jen's point especially, I think it's terribly important when we get beyond the pilot. So utilities should be piloting low-income transit on the heavy-duty side. They should be working out partnerships and piloting these charging infrastructures right now, because the charging infrastructure for both in terms of megawatt-size loads and the time and everything is totally different than either residential or workplace charging. So it may have to be a separate tariff for beneficial electrification or whatever you want to call it, and that's going to be a tough road to hoe with the commissions. I'm hoping we can get folks like Jen and consumer advocates to support utilities when they come through with a charging infrastructure tariff or some rate recovery for a transit agency that serves all people. There's a lot of experimentation going on right now. I was on a call with Valley Transit in the Phoenix, Maricopa County area. They're looking at all electric buses, but also they have a service, as many transit agencies do, that have to deal with people in wheelchairs, ACA, people who need to be picked up to go to the hospital, or to the doctor's appointment. So all electric vehicles could serve those needs, but those are going to be difficult use cases and charging types. So, and the other thing I'd say to Jonathan's point, I'm a big believer in let 1,000 flowers bloom. So there's a lot of experimentation going on in cities, counties around the country. Atlanta is talking about doing a nonprofit agency that helps low-income people who live in difficult-to-serve housing, and it would be the Southern Company or Georgia Power with a bunch of groups, environmental NGOs, but they need somebody to run that, and then they need to get funding. And there are other experiments in Seattle, San Francisco, besides Maven Gig, what Jonathan was talking about. I mean, over time, over time, Lisa, the shared economy. I mean, if we can get shared EVs that service these multi-unit dwellings where many low-income people live, and if that serves the needs of that community, then that may be a way to go. But right now, I think it's public transit. Public transit we need to focus on.
Well, actually, I was going to move on to a question that's related that came in the chat box. So in the report and in the presentations, some of you have talked about how Uber and Lyft's use has increased, but how are services like those companies advancing EV adoption and use? John, do you want to pick that up?
Sure, I'm happy to start.
Maven Gig.
Yeah. Well, and it's Maven. GM's Maven Gig is a great example because they're putting the Chevy Bolt in, and I'll talk about some others as well. But as I mentioned from the earlier point on lack of awareness of EVs, rideshare drivers can be EV ambassadors in a way that not only give you the benefits to the environment of the EV usage there, but also the proselytization and the increased market penetration. Some of the GM Maven Gig drivers reported that the number one topic they were getting into discussions with their consumers on was electric vehicles, and people were asking about it. Did they like it? What did they think? And in some of the anecdotal conversations we've had with Maven drivers that drive the Chevy Bolt, they love the car in part because of the lower total cost of ownership, in part because it's quieter and less stressful, and because they can integrate the charging into their lunch break. They obviously want more infrastructure, but that's one big part of it. I think the rest of it is, though, recognizing that no matter who the driver or the company is, there's this risk that increased vehicle miles traveled through deadhead miles, which is when the car is driving without you to come pick you up, means that we have to make sure they're electric. So Lyft is going carbon neutral. Everybody has been talking about doing more and more on penetrating EVs into their fleets. I think there's active discussions happening with policymakers and companies and everybody else. It's going to require a big concerted effort. Some of it's going to require demand from consumers, but some of it is going to be policy helping to set what needs to happen in those particular markets with rideshare. But it does feel like the economics are so well aligned with price-sensitive rideshare drivers who benefit from that lower total cost of ownership that EVs are inevitable there, and the accelerant is really what's at question.
Great. Did you want to jump in here, Phil?
Just a quick point. I agree with what Jonathan said. A lot of innovation, a lot of good stuff happening, but from a charging infrastructure perspective and the role of the utility can play a very important role here because they do not regulate. Obviously, Uber and Lyft, at least many state commissions, do not regulate TNCs, and I don't think that those who don't do it today want to do that in the future. But they will have a role in the charging infrastructure, and what Portland General has done in downtown Portland, for example, is build out what they call electric avenues. This is a combination of DC fast charging with two charging types, what is called CCS combo, and CHAdeMO, so it can service all range of vehicles. And they have a level 2 public charging station there as well. These are being heavily utilized now by ride-sharing companies that are trying to incorporate EVs into the system. So this pace is going to increase, but the issue of siting those urban DC charging stations, curbside, the street, it's going to require a community there, and so the city transportation department, everybody's going to have to understand the need for this and get on board. So the charging infrastructure is going to be a challenge to get done.
Let's move on to a sort of a different sector. Someone asked near the top of our webinar, how do you see the retail sector playing a role in the electrification of transportation, especially with respect to building out infrastructure? Do you see major corporate players like Walmart, Target, and others weighing in on state and regional EV policy in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, they're not just going to...
Jonathan,
go ahead, Phil.
No, I was just going to break it down in two parts and see if this makes sense. One is for the restructured states that have ISOs where you have retail, like Texas, you have retail electric service providers that actually sell these services. We haven't seen, in those states, a real move toward coming on with this EV transformation yet. In fact, in the state of Pennsylvania, some of those folks have actually opposed us or opposed the movement toward a statewide EV transportation system for the state of Pennsylvania. So I don't think the retail ESPs, because of their business model, the thin margins, and the fact that they sell other services to consumers, that's going to be a tough road to hoe, especially when you have universal access to the charging services, disadvantaged communities, multi-unit dwellings. A lot of these, quote, retail service providers do not want to get involved in that. On the question, the more important one, or the more interesting one now, is the Amazons, Walmarts of the world. Yes, they're getting very interested in this. Walmart just struck a deal with Electrify America. We have not been involved in that. Walmart is not a member of ours. But, they struck a deal with Electrify America to put charging stations at many of their stores. Amazon is getting interested in this. FedEx is getting interested in this. UPS. So the whole commercial delivery fleet sector is getting quite interested in doing this. They're working with startup companies, and they're starting to talk seriously with utilities about what a commercial fleet charging model would look like. So, yeah, it's happening.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to talk about. EVgo already has more than 100 fast chargers at Walmart's. Retail hosts are critical in this. There's also the role to play for parking lot owners that are at a massive scale, right? There are nationwide stakeholders that have property holdings across the country that can move quickly, both parking lots on their own, but more importantly, those that are closely concentrated to grocery stores, like we mentioned, Whole Foods, Save Mart, Lucky's, others that the EVgo has already worked with. And those are the best partners, because then they're integrating into the regular life of American drivers who just want to have their car being charged while they're doing something else and getting that benefit. So those retailers are already very important to EVgo. We've got partnerships with Simon Malls, with Kimco Properties, and we're going to keep expanding on those as we rapidly grow our network beyond the 1,000 fast chargers across the country today.
Lisa, can I add one more thing?
Yeah, please.
Just about the siting of the commercially used chargers is that the siting should be done in a way that's not going to create an additional environmental justice concern, that there should be some care taken so that they're not sited excessively in disadvantaged communities, because there's the risk that it will increase commercial traffic to those communities to use the chargers. And then the other pollution issue of particulate matter from tires of EVs, which are typically heavier than ICE cars. So just that's another issue to be aware of.
Great. Let's move on to another question. A couple of questions have come in about stakeholder assessments of various areas, whether it's low and middle income issues, environmental issues, future cost structure issues. So one general question that came in was about who should lead this stakeholder assessment of state needs, and should it be at a state level? Should it be at a local level? Should it be at a county, regional level? So who's best poised to lead these assessments? What do you think works? Whoever wants to jump in first here.
I'll reflect my bias in my essay being a former state commissioner, Lisa, so I think a state commission should generally lead these. But that's not to say that other state agencies should not be involved, but for example, in my state, the city of Seattle, city of Tacoma, King County are very active as well. But there are certain issues that have statewide implications. For example, on affordability or access to the vehicles, the state tax credit comes in, or the exemption from the sales and use tax, right? And so that needs to be considered on a statewide basis and not at a local government basis. So even the local governments, I think, recognize that the state has a big role to play in here. But yeah, I believe that the commission should be a facilitator. They should not necessarily lead everything. If a state DOT wants to get involved, many state departments of transportation really, frankly, haven't stepped up to the game yet. On the Volkswagen settlement funding, many state environmental agencies have stepped up. They can be facilitators, or the state energy offices, part of NASIO. The state energy offices could too. So it's going to take a team approach, and the governor's office is going to have to provide overall direction. But I think with suitable direction from the governor or the legislature, the commission is probably the best place to lead the facilitation.
But just to push back on that a little bit, Phil, the part of the issue is with the big IOUs, that makes a ton of sense. But when it comes to munis and especially rural electric co-ops, we have to make sure we're not leaving out broad swaths of the country in that regard, and especially as the rural electric co-ops are, frankly, at this point in time, a misnomer because so many of them are suburban electric co-ops. We have large swaths of population there. I think it kind of goes back to the earlier point Phil made about separating out what we're talking about. The corridors are a great example where both the Federal Department of Transportation has taken a look through the FAST Act at designating corridors that are EV ready or need to be EV ready. State DOTs have been very involved there. And then, the Appendix D funding from the Dieselgate settlement that Phil mentioned, EVgo is the first of the Appendix D funding that's been awarded by the Commonwealth of Virginia. That came from the Department of Environmental Quality there, whereas other states have chosen to go through their DOTs or through their energy offices. So I think it's going to end up being based on the local facts on the ground. A state that has a lot of urban concentrations is going to have very different needs than rural states. And so it's going to be dependent, I think, on what that looks like for utility jurisdiction, for state energy offices, for DOTs. And the more important thing is just bringing the right people in. And Jennifer may have additional thoughts on this, but making sure that voices are being heard that aren't just the usual suspects is really critical. One thing we've learned from the Appendix D processes is when states decide to go with an entity that's used to doing diesel retrofits and hear from stakeholders that are doing diesel retrofits, they allocate most of their money for diesel retrofits. Similarly, if we're not getting the environmental justice community in and the transportation planners in and the utility folks in, we're going to end up over-indexing on one part of the problem. So we do need leadership that is state and locality reflective of the special needs of each of those states and localities to make sure we're building out in a way that is good for the end consumer.
I want to let Jen chime in here, especially with respect to diverse state coalitions that might include some of the folks that you represent.
Right. Well, it sounds like we're, all somewhat on the same page, that some sort of state coordination and support of local efforts would be needed. But I think, it's true that if a state agency is coordinating listening sessions for the public, you're not going to get a lot of low income or probably just any many regular people, regular citizens, consumers just coming and participating in that. It's not very welcoming. So that really, community organizations are going to do a better job of reaching out to people in their community. So having, some sort of broad coordination at the state level, but then working with kind of trusted local organizations who already have relationships with diverse stakeholders, with diverse communities, I think is one approach.
Great. We have 3 minutes left. I'm going to ask one more question. Let's see if you can get your responses in quickly. So there's a lot of concern about managed charging and to have those benefits, potential benefits that Philip alluded to for the distribution system. So where do you see managed charging heading? How long until it becomes widespread, and what does it look like?
Well, I'll start with that. It's a rapidly the technology is changing constantly, and so as I said before in my openers, some of this technology is being deployed in the telematics on the car. Some of it is with the EVSE itself, and some of it may be utility developed. So it's all over the place. But the issue is related to dynamic pricing. I think most utilities and most commissions feel that if we are going to get the benefits of greater utilization of the grid, lower revenue requirements, and admittedly higher revenues for the utility over time through more kilowatt-hour sales, it needs to be managed. And so there are a variety of ways of doing this. Some of it is through demand response. Some of it is through timers on the EVSE or on the car. All the cars, of course, all the EVs come with timers. But it's really important here, and this is difficult. I think Jonathan alluded to the fact that even in California, only 50% of consumers know what an EV is or know even beyond Tesla. So we have a lot of work to do in this consumer behavior area and how consumers react, but I think it's absolutely clear that through time of use pricing and a lot of education of consumers, and then the consumer would have to opt in, of course, into a demand response program or something that actually where the utility could control the load of their battery that's distributed at their household. But this is the direction we're headed in. I'm confident.
Jonathan, we have about 1 minute.
Yeah, so I think, look, managed charging is going to be part of the solution. There's some of it that can be done now in terms of the throughput. There's some of it that is further off. V to G tends to be the talking point, but I think V1G is more important right now. From a consumer perspective, there's obviously the automakers have had concerns about two-way flows of charging and what it means to the warranty of the car. But more importantly, we need to make sure that consumers aren't stranded. So what works for level 2 charging at home or at workplace and throttling down rates and making sure that people can still get what they get is different than on-demand DCFC. We don't want a father or a mother with 2 kids in the back seat on a 100-degree day and no juice in the tank to have to not be able to take a charge because there's something going on. Price signals may come into play, throughput rates may come into play, but we have to make sure we're delivering the electricity when they need it so that we're giving consumers the safe, reliable, affordable access to charging they need.
Great. We'll have to leave it there. I want to thank our presenters and authors, Philip Jones, Jonathan Levy, and Jennifer Bosco, the U.S. Department of Energy, for funding this series. Stay tuned. Our next report up is Utility Investments in Resilience, and we hope you'll join us for a future webinar. Thanks to all.
Thank you.